Now we're on chapter 20, looking at ecosystems and the biosphere. This is a fairly long chapter. So what we're going to start out looking at is the energy flow through the ecosystems. Your ecosystem is a community of living organisms and their abiotic environment. The abiotic environment is the non-living things in the environment. Your freshwater ecosystems make up 1.8% of the Earth. The marine ecosystems make up 75% of the Earth. And then your terrestrial ecosystems get grouped into biomes. The biomes are large communities of organisms that are primarily defined on land by predominant plant types in geographic regions of similar climate. So here we've got a picture of a Carner blue butterfly, and then over on the right we have a wild lupine in the oak pine barren habitats in North America. Just a couple of examples of organisms. In picture A, we have a tidal pool ecosystem in Matinicus Island, Maine. It's a small ecosystem, where over on the right you've got the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. That would be an example of a large ecosystem. So ecosystems are going to like to have a state of equilibrium. It's a dynamic state in which, despite changes in species and numbers and disturbances in the biodiversity, remain constant. So there will be some fluctuations, but overall the numbers remain relatively constant. When we look at resistance, it's the ability of an ecosystem to remain at equilibrium in spite of disturbances. So how much can it resist being basically having things altered before you're going to see changes in the ecosystem? Resilience is how quickly it can recover after being disturbed. So we can see desert ecosystems in these two pictures, and you can see they vary quite a bit. The left picture is the Saguaro National Park in Arizona. It does have abundant plant life, where over on the right is the Boa Vista Island in Cape Verde, Africa. This desert is devoid of plant life. So one of the ways we can look at the organisms and look at their food levels is to look at food chains and food webs. A food chain is going to be a linear sequence of organisms through which the nutrients and energy pass as one organism eats another. So basically it's lined up with a series of arrows of who eats who, eats who, eats who down the line. There is some limitations to using a food chain, though. It does assume that each organism is only going to eat one food source. Your trophic levels are going to look at the energy levels or the position in the food chain or the food web. So troph just means to eat. The producers are your base or your foundation of the food chain. These are going to be the photosynthetic organisms because they're going to be able to produce organic matter using energy from sunlight. Your primary consumers are going to consume the producers. Your secondary consumers, these are usually carnivores that are going to eat the primary consumers. Your tertiary consumers are going to be carnivores that eat other carnivores. And your apex consumers are at the top of the food chain. There is going to be a limited number of steps on the food chain. Your energy is going to limit how many steps there is because at each trophic level, as you move up, the heat and transfer to decomposers is going to take away a significant portion of the energy. So here we have an example of a food chain here with different trophic levels. So your green algae would be the producer because they can do photosynthesis. The primary consumer would be the mollusks that eat that green algae. Secondary consumer would be the slimy sculpin that would eat the mollusks, and then your apex or tertiary consumer here would be the Chinook salmon. So the problem with the food chain is that some organisms can feed on multiple trophic levels. We as humans can feed on multiple trophic levels. We can eat other consumers. We can also eat the producers. The food web accounts for multiple trophic interactions between each species of the many that it feeds on. And there are multiple ways of doing food webs or food chains. To say you would make a food web that would include every single organism on the planet would be an absolute disaster. You're usually going to make a food web looking at the specific species you're interested in, just to keep it simple and useful. Raising food webs, these have photosynthetic organisms as a base, and they're followed by herbivores and various carnivores. We also have detrital food webs. These are going to have a base of organisms that feed on decaying organic matter, so these will include your decomposers and detrivores. So looking at the relative energy in the trophic levels, this is from an example in Silver Springs, Florida. You've got your producers and their energy content. So they go all the way across the table. It reduces way down here for your primary consumers. It's reduced even more for your secondary consumers. And there's just a fraction of it that makes it here to be your tertiary consumers. So there really wouldn't be anything left to have an additional level go up the food energy levels here. So here we can see a food web, and it's showing the interactions between organisms across the trophic levels. So the arrow points to an organism that is consumed and the organism that consumes it. Okay, sorry for the interruption there. The food web here is showing the interactions across the different trophic levels. So you can see that you can have here that you've got the squirrel, and the squirrel gets eaten by the fox, but also by the owl. So it's going to accommodate a little bit more realistic picture of what actually happens. So in the food web, you have the autotroph. They're able to synthesize their own food using organic carbon. A photoautotroph uses sunlight as its energy source, where a chemoautotroph is going to use an inorganic molecule as an energy source. Your gross primary productivity is the rate at which photosynthetic producers incorporate energy from the sun. Your net primary productivity is the energy that remains after the producers account for these organisms' own respiration and heat loss. It's basically what is available to the consumers at the next level. So here we've got some swimming shrimp, some squat lobsters, and some vent mussels here that are in a hydrothermal vent at the bottom of the ocean. There's no sunlight at this point, so this ecosystem is supported by chemoautotrophic bacteria. So they're going to use inorganic chemicals as an energy source to make their food. So biomagnification is the increasing concentration of persistent toxic substances at each successive trophic level. These substances are fat soluble, and it will include DDT and PCBs. So mercury is an example of something that gets biomagnified in the ocean into the seafood. So this chart here is showing the example with PCB concentrations found at various trophic levels. So when you would have that stuff in the phytoplankton here, you've got the zebra mussels that are going to consume that. So you've got multiple phytoplankton that have eaten just a small amount, but a zebra mussel is going to eat multiple phytoplankton. Then the next fish up the line is going to eat multiple of these organisms. This one up here eats multiple of these organisms. So all of those toxic materials from all of the previous organisms that have been eaten along the line start to accumulate, and you end up with them in much higher levels by the time you get up here higher in the food chain. So for us as humans, when we eat fish, this is a potentially serious problem because we are eating all the toxins that we've thrown into the ocean for those fish to eat. So we have biogeochemical cycles. This is going to be the recycling of inorganic matter between the living organisms and their non-living environments. So all of the stuff that is on the earth is constantly going to be recycled. The hydrosphere is the area of the earth where water movement and storage occur. So the first one we're going to look at as the water cycle. Fresh water is 2.5%. Salt water is 97.5%. Less than 1% of the fresh water is in lakes and rivers. Most of it is either underground or as ice. Water is going to cycle through evaporation, where it will go from being a liquid to a gas, or sublimation, where it goes from being ice to a gas, so if you had snow directly evaporate. Condensation or precipitation, where it will come from a gas into a liquid. You have surface water flow, surface runoff and snowmelt, and stream flow. So this graphic just shows you here that your salt water is 97.5% and the fresh water is only 2.5% of the water. And of this fresh water, you have 0.3% that's lakes and rivers, groundwater 30.8%, and glaciers and permanent snow cover is 68.9%. So less than 1% of the fresh water is actually easily accessible to living things. So this graphic is going to illustrate the water cycle. You're going to have water from the land and the oceans is going to enter the atmosphere by either evaporation or sublimation. It will condense into clouds and then it will fall down as rain or snow, which is precipitation. That water can either enter the freshwater bodies, it can fall into the ocean, or it can infiltrate the soil. The cycle is complete when the surface or groundwater re-enters the ocean. Next is the carbon cycle. The biological carbon cycle is going to involve the autotrophs using carbon dioxide to make glucose. This would be things like your plants using carbon dioxide to make glucose, and then the heterotrophs will break down the glucose and release carbon dioxide. That would be like your animals eating the plants and releasing carbon dioxide. The biogeochemical carbon cycle is going to cycle through land, water, air, and it moves more slowly. So when we talk about something being a non-renewable resource, it's either regenerated very slowly or not at all. This is your fossil fuels. So they are regenerated so slowly that we would never see that in our lifetime, our children's lifetimes, our grandchildren's lifetimes. Subduction is the movement of one tectonic plate beneath another. Carbon sediments taken into the earth from the ocean floors can be released as carbon dioxide from volcanoes or hydrothermic vents. So here you can see we've got carbon dioxide gas that's going to exist in the atmosphere, and it can also be dissolved in water. Photosynthesis is going to convert the carbon dioxide gas back to organic carbon, and then the respiration cycles that organisms like the animals will do will cycle the organic carbon back into carbon dioxide gas. Your long-term storage of carbon, organic carbon, is when the matter from living organisms is buried deep underground and becomes fossilized. Volcanic activity and more recently human emissions are going to bring carbon back into the carbon cycle by releasing them into the atmosphere. So with the nitrogen cycle, here you've got the plants and the phytoplankton that cannot incorporate nitrogen gas, which is in the form of two nitrogens. That also makes up 78% of the atmosphere. It's going to enter the living world through symbiotic bacteria that do nitrogen fixation. So with nitrogen fixation, you're going to convert what is N2 into NH3, nitrogen gas to ammonia. This is done by the rhizobiums and the legume root nodules. Organic nitrogen is eventually converted back into nitrogen gas by bacteria. So one of the things that makes the legumes such a beneficial plant is they can actually work with the rhizobium and help to fix nitrogen for other plants to grow in the soil. So a lot of times if you look, when people would do cover crops, growing legumes as a cover crop is one option to try and bring more usable nitrogen back into the soil. Organic nitrogen gets converted back into nitrogen gas then through ammonification, where you're going to convert nitrogenous waste from living animals and the remains of dead animals into ammonium. Through nitrification, where the ammonium is converted into the nitrites by nitrifying bacteria like the Nitrosomonas, and the nitrites get converted into nitrates. And then through denitrification, where the bacteria convert the nitrates into nitrogen gas, things like the Pseudomonas and Clostridium. With eutrophication, you have nutrient runoff into bodies of fresh water or salt water, and this will cause overgrowth in algae and other problems. So here is showing the nitrogen cycle. You can have nitrogen from the atmosphere that's going to be converted through nitrogen-fixing bacteria into a useful form in the soil. You also have the nitrogenous waste from the animals gets processed back into the gaseous nitrogen by soil bacteria. It will also supply the terrestrial food webs with the organic nitrogen they need. So we also have a phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is a major component of nucleic acids and also calcium phosphate in bones. It's often the limiting nutrient in aquatic environments, especially in freshwater ecosystems. Excessive phosphorus and nitrogen runoff from fertilizer and sewer will cause excessive growth of algae, and then they will eventually die and they deplete the dissolved oxygen, and then you end up with death of the other aquatic organisms. This can result in dead zones, which are areas in the lakes or oceans near the mouths of rivers, where large areas are periodically depleted of the normal flora and fauna. So in nature, you've got your phosphorus cycle, where the phosphorus will exist as the phosphate ion. When you have weathering of rocks and volcanic activity, it's going to release phosphate into the soil, water, and air, and then it will be available to the terrestrial food webs. The phosphate enters into the ocean in the surface runoff, the groundwater flow, and river flow. The phosphate dissolved in the ocean water will enter into the marine food webs. Some of the phosphate from the marine food webs falls into the ocean floor and becomes sediment. So here is showing some dead zones that occur when phosphorus and nitrogen from fertilizer have caused excessive growth of microorganisms, depleting the oxygen and killing the fauna. So worldwide, what we are seeing is there are large dead zones that are found in areas of high population density. So we as humans are creating them. So this image here is going to show the Chesapeake Bay, which is an ecosystem that's been affected by the phosphate and nitrate runoff. And here they're holding a clump of oysters that are being used as part of a oyster restoration effort in that bay. So then we also have a sulfur cycle. Sulfur is an important part of your amino acid cysteine that's involved in forming the proteins. You find sulfur in a lot of the proteins that tend to be harder. So in your fingernails and your hair are a couple examples of places in your body where you're going to have a fair amount of sulfur. Sulfur dioxide is going to enter the atmosphere by decomposing organic molecules, geothermal activity, and burning fossil fuels. So sulfur deposits on land through precipitation, through direct fallout from the atmosphere, rock weathering, and geothermal vents. So if you're around any geothermal vents, you can typically smell the sulfur in them. So acid rain is going to be precipitation that falls to the ground through sulfur dioxide becoming sulfuric acid. So your sulfur dioxide from the atmosphere is going to become available to the terrestrial and marine ecosystems when it's dissolved as precipitation. will come down as weak sulfuric acid, or when it falls directly to the earth as fallout. You can get some from weathering of rocks and then decomposing of living organisms. Here's a sulfur vent in Lassen Volcanic National Park in Northeast California. You can see yellowish sulfur deposits near the mouth of the vent. Sometimes you can see the yellowish sulfur deposits. You can also smell the sulfur when you go around any place that has the geothermal activity or a lot of hot springs. So the terrestrial biomes, these are based on temperature, precipitation, and climate. There are 8 major biomes that are going to be distinguished by characteristic temperatures and precipitations. There are also subdivisions of some of these biomes. So some things don't fit exactly in a strict definition. So this also will show where you've got mountains here in purple, mountain ranges, and then where you've got the polar ice. So the tropical rainforest or tropical wet forest, this is found in the equatorial regions. It's the most diverse, it's closest to the equator. The average temperature range is 20 to 34 degrees Celsius or 68 to 93 degrees Fahrenheit. It tends to have 11 to 12 hours of sunlight. That's pretty consistent all year long. You don't have a lot of fluctuation in the daylight hours at the equator. Precipitation, 250 to 450 centimeters, or 8.2 to 14.8 feet. And rather than having fall, winter, spring, summer, it's more of a wet and dry season that you'll get along the equator here. They have high net primary productivity. They have stable temperatures to support growth, and you'll tend to see vertical layers of vegetation. The soil is poor in nutrients because the rain washes them away. So here's an example of tropical wet forest near the Amazon River. Savannas, these are grasslands with scattered trees. They're seen in Africa, South America, and North Australia. They tend to be hot, temperatures 24 to 29 degrees Celsius or 75 to 84 degrees Fahrenheit. That's an average temperature range. It can be outside of that temperature. Rainfall 51 to 127 centimeters or 20 to 50 inches. They have extensive dry season with fires, but the plants do have well-developed roots that allow for quick resprouting after fires. So although the savanna you can see here is in Queensland, Australia, it's dominated by grasses, but you can have small woodlands like in this one where you can see some trees. So fires are a regular, normal occurrence. So deserts, these are subtropical, between 15 and 30 degrees north and south, centered on the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer. They're frequently on the downwind or lee side of mountain ranges in rain shadows. The global winds are going to help make these areas dry, so they are actually not on the equator like some people would expect. They are just above or below the equator by 15 to 30 degrees. So they tend to be very dry. A lot of times evaporation will exceed the precipitation. They'll have less than 30 centimeters or 12 inches of precipitation in a year. They can have really wide temperature fluctuations. A lot of times the assumption is that the desert is really hot. They can be very cold, and you can have both in the same day. So your daytime soil surface temperature can be above 60 degrees Celsius or 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So in the United States, Death Valley is our hottest place. And then nighttime approaching 0 degrees or 32 degrees Fahrenheit, it can get below freezing. They have low species diversity due to the unpredictable precipitation. Many of the animals that are there are going to be nocturnal to deal with the heat. Most of the plants are annuals, so they'll reproduce when it's rain, and then their seeds can lie dormant. Now here's a couple of examples A lot of the desert plants don't really have leaves, or they have very small leaves to try and reduce the water loss. So this is in Big Bend National Park in Texas. The chaparral, this is the scrub forest. You see this in California, the Mediterranean Sea area, the south coast of Australia. Precipitation is going to be 65 to 75 centimeters, or 25.6 to 29.5 inches. The majority of it falls in the winter. The summers tend to be dry. The vegetation here is mostly shrubs that's adapted to periodic fires. Fire is a natural part of the maintenance here, so a lot of times we hear about the wildfires in California, and the wildfires are a very natural part of that biome. Humans have just come to live in the biome, and the fires are inconvenient for us. So here's an example of a picture where you can see it's dominated by shrubs. Your temperate grasslands, these are seen in the prairies of central North America and the steppes of Eurasia. They have hot summers, cold winters, and a specific growing season. So their precipitation ranges 25.4 to 88.9 centimeters, or 10 to 35 inches. They have few trees. It's mostly grass due to the relatively low precipitation and frequent fires. Also, the grazing of the animals. The soil is fertile from having the roots and rhizomes of the grasses. Again, here, fire are natural disturbances. Without fire, it eventually converts to scrub and dense forest. Here's an example of an American bison, or the buffalo. It's a grazing mammal that once populated the American prairies in huge numbers. So the temperate forests, these are the most common biome in the eastern North America, Western Europe, Eastern Asia, Chile, New Zealand, and the mid-latitude regions. Temperature range is pretty wide, negative 30 to 30 degrees Celsius, or 22 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, and there are 4 defined seasons here. So on the East Coast, the 4 defined seasons are what typically will draw people to see the leaves in the fall. The precipitation is relatively constant, 75 to 150 centimeters, or 29.5 to 59 inches. Here the deciduous trees dominate, so that's what gives those nice colors that people go see in the fall in the northeast part of the country. The soil is rich in inorganic and organic nutrients due to the thick leaf litter. So here you can see the deciduous trees. The deciduous tree is just one that's going to lose its leaves. They're the dominant plant in the temperate forests. So your boreal forest is sometimes called the taiga or coniferous forest. These are located from 50 to 60 degrees north across most of Canada, Alaska, Russia, Northern Europe, and also above certain elevations in the mountain ranges. Tend to have cold, dry winters, short, cool, wet summers. The precipitation ranges from 40 to 100 centimeters, or 15.7 to 39 inches. There is little evaporation of the water due to the cold. Here, the predominant cold-tolerant cone, you see cone-bearing plants, your evergreen trees. The soils tend to be acidic with little nitrogen available. They have lower net primary productivity than the temperate forest and less species diversity. So the needles are slower to decompose than broadleaves. We actually have a fair number of needled trees in this area. So if you have pine needles that you have to deal with, you know that they do not break down very quickly. They also will stop a lot of other things from growing underneath them because they are so acidic in the soil. So here's a picture of a boreal forest, or a taiga, with low-lying plants and conifer trees. Then the Arctic tundra. This is north of the subarctic boreal forests, the Arctic regions of the northern hemisphere, and elevations above the tree line in the mountains. So you can actually see a little bit of this type of area if you go up to Mount Rainier. It's easier to see it on the sunrise side. Winter temperatures average from negative 34 degrees Celsius and negative 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Your summer average is 3 to 12 degrees Celsius or 37 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit. The plants have a short growing season, but they have long days of sunlight in the summer for rapid growth. So what we see here in Washington, with being relatively far north, is we have really short days in the winter and we have longer days in the summer. So that helps the plants during the summer months. The Arctic tundra has low precipitation, 15 to 25 centimeters, only 6 to 10 inches. There's little species diversity and low productivity. The permafrost is one of the reasons for that. That's where the soil is permanently frozen. It never thaws throughout the year. The plants that you do see are low to the ground, and they're slow to decay for soil nutrients because they don't decay real well when they're frozen. So here in this picture you can see low-growing plants like the shrub willow dominating the tundra here. So our aquatic and marine biomes, these are going to be influenced by light, temperature, the flow regime, and the dissolved solids. Water temperature affects the rate of growth and the amount of dissolved oxygen available for respiration. So here we see some sea stars, sea urchins, and mussel shells that are found in the intertidal zone. These are from Kachemak Bay, Alaska. If you wanted to see these types of organisms, you can actually see sea stars and sand dollars pretty easily at Dash Point State Park in Federal Way. So with the marine biomes, they are divided into different zones based on how far they are from land and the amount of light that they get. The pelagic zone is the ocean's open water. The benthic zone is going to extend along the ocean bottom from the shoreline to the deepest parts of the ocean floor. Your photic zone is going to be from the surface down to approximately 200 meters or 650 feet. This is where photosynthesis can occur. The aphotic zone is going to be at depths greater than 200 meters. There is no light or photosynthesis. This is actually the majority of the ocean. We don't really know what the deepest point of the ocean is at this point. The intertidal zone is closest to land. It's going to alternate between wet and dry with the tides. It can be sandy, rocky, muddy. You can have mangroves. The neritic zone is going to be from the margin of the intertidal zone down to the depth of about 200 meters. It's at the edge of the continental shelf. Here it's well oxygenated. There's low pressure, stable temperature. It's the area of highest productivity and biodiversity. So your benthic zone is going to be beneath the pelagic zone. This is deep water beyond the continental shelf. It's nutrient rich due to having dead organisms that fall down in there. And then the abyssal zone, this is the deepest part of the ocean. It can be 4,000 meters deep or greater. It's very cold, very high pressure. The high pressure is one of the difficulties in exploring this part. It's high in oxygen but low in nutrients. You're going to have chemosynthetic bacteria that use hydrogen sulfide from hydrothermal vents. We have coral reefs. These are formed by invertebrates of the shallow waters in the photic zone. They're within 30 degrees north and south of the equator. The Great Barrier Reef is probably the best known. You have coral-forming cnidaria that secrete calcium carbonate skeletons, and they have a mutualistic relationship with photosynthetic unicellular protists. So here the water is nutritionally poor and needs mutualism, but it is a very diverse biome. So this picture here really does help to illustrate those different regions of the ocean here in the marine biomes. You've got your intertidal zone that alternates, your neritic zone, the oceanic zone, and then you can go down deeper, ocean zone, photic zone, aphotic zone, and the abyssal zone. Those are all in the pelagic realm. This is just showing some examples of some coral reefs. So estuaries and freshwater. Lakes and ponds are going to vary on their size. The temperature is an important abiotic factor. You can have thermal stratification. If you go swimming in any lakes, it can be pretty noticeable when you're in the water on the top. it can feel pretty warm, and then if you have your body completely vertical in the water or you dive down in the water, you can notice a very significant temperature drop. So your nitrogen and phosphorus are important limiting nutrients. And so when we say a limiting nutrient, they're what's going to help to control population growths. If you have a large input of phosphorus and nitrogen, it will lead to algal blooms. They will die, they decompose, then the oxygen is depleted, and the fish and the other organisms die. So throwing in more of those nutrients isn't necessarily a good thing. It's having the correct balance. So here is an example of an estuary where you're going to have fresh water and salt water meet. This is at the mouth of the Klamath River in California. We have several places where you can actually see estuaries in Washington State. This is an example of uncontrolled growth of algae in a waterway. So you can see it's just thick green in the water. So when we look at rivers and streams, their abiotic features are going to vary along the length of the river. Your source water is the point of origin of the river or the stream. You can actually see one that it's about a 14-mile walk due to the road closure, but you can see where the Carbon River starts. You can actually hike back in and see the mouth of the Carbon River where it starts to form off of the Carbon Glacier. The channel is the width of the river or the stream. When it's faster moving, you have minimal silt, and you'll have clear water, which inhibits the growth of the phytoplankton. The amount of photosynthesis is influenced by the tree cover. Energy can come from leaves falling in the water, which will support the food chain. So in slower moving water or wider channels, you're going to have more silt. It's not as clear, but the water is warmer. And you'll have longer exposure to sunlight, so you'll have more predatory vertebrates. With these, they can be too wide for tree cover. So here's an example of a narrow and shallow, and this is a wide and slow-moving river. So wetlands, here the soil is permanently or periodically saturated with water. And you also have several of them available to see in this area. One nice place to be able to go and look through them, they have a boardwalk so you don't have to sink into the mud, is down at the Nisqually Basin, down on the way to Olympia. Emergent vegetation is going to be wetland plants that are rooted in the soil, but they have a portion that of the leaves or stems or flowers that are above the surface. This is going to include your marshes, your swamps, bogs, mudflats, salt marshes. Your marshes and swamps have slow, steady water flow, where bogs have little or no water flow. This is an example in the Florida Everglades. So you can see you've got the mangroves in here. So where you have mangroves, you tend to have large reptiles. Here you've got an egret that's walking among the trees too.